On this episode of The Median, I interviewed Jack Tate. He's a former Colorado State Senator, and he's now currently a businessman. We have a great show. We talk about legislative bodies and what he believes why they have a lack of financial and economic understanding. We then talk about the handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. And lastly, we talk about immigration and the border. So without any further ado, hope everyone enjoys the show. Everyone, and welcome to The Median, the most apolitical political podcast promoting civil political discourse. I am your host, Alex Cuesta, and with me for my first ever video on YouTube that's going to be going up, plus the audio, is former Colorado State Senator and businessman Jack Tate. Jack, thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, Alex, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
So, Jack, how long were you a member of the Colorado State government?
I was a member of the Colorado General Assembly for 6 years. Initially a member of the State House for 1 year, and then a member of the State Senate for 5 years. During that time, I did serve a couple of years as chair of the Senate Committee on Commerce and was involved in the Senate Finance Committee, Technology Committees, things like that. Generally, issues related to economic development, capital investment, commerce, labor, et cetera, et cetera.
So a little bit of everything, all the important stuff that we kind of need to function as a state and a country. So
you'd be surprised. A lot of people think other things are important.
So, and your term just ended in January. So you were in the middle of the thicket of COVID-19, and over the last 6 years, a lot of changes going on in Colorado, and Colorado kind of being the flagship for some different things that are trickling down all around the United States now. So I'm pretty sure a lot of that experience is going to jump in. So I like to ask a lot of all my guests. I'm kind of trying to get away from the narrative of where we label ourselves as our political party, because I think a major problem with political discourse is someone walks around and says, I'm a Republican, I'm a conservative. And in your case, you were that because that was your profession. But in general, it's our ideology. It's not who we are. So ideologically, where do you fit in? Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal? Where do you find yourself?
Well, yeah, I served as a Republican senator in a representing a suburban district of Denver Metro.
Okay.
So I think ideologically, I was kind of considered a political moderate, someone who pretty much tried to champion the business community and the private sector in terms of job creation and economic policy that promoted business investment.
All right. So what we normally do for any new listeners, I'm going to talk to Jack about the topics that we discussed a little earlier that he picked. He's going to lay out his floor, and I'm going to play devil's advocate. And from there, we're going to have a nice, good civil political discourse so that anyone who takes the time to listen isn't just hearing people yelling at each other. As fun as that could be sometimes, that is not what we are here for. So we're going to have a good time. So away we go. So the first topic that we're going to talk about is we're going to jump right into it because this is something that you suggested after we kind of bounced back and forth with some topics. And
I was winging it, but I'm happy to talk about anything. So
and
if this topic flames out, we can go to another one.
Oh, yeah. Listen, I don't think it'll flame out. People with your experience and knowledge, you guys have more wealth of knowledge than you even understand. But so you wanted to talk about legislative bodies' lack of financial and economic understanding. And I think as a businessman and someone that served on all the committees that you did, you have a good understanding of this. So what is your position on this? Why do you believe what you believe there?
Well, I mean, I guess it's just more an observation. When I have colleagues who don't really understand the difference between profit margin, and revenue, to me, that's a problem. Ultimately, a company could have $10 billion of revenue, but if they're losing $2 billion, it doesn't necessarily mean they, quote, have a lot of resources to spend or a lot of extra room to incur costs that some of my colleagues think they should incur, because after all, they're a wealthy, rich corporation based on the perception of what their revenue is, not necessarily the bottom line. And I think, in addition, there's also a confusion in terms of leverage and capital investment. If someone makes a significant capital investment, whatever the sector, energy, real estate, you name it, manufacturing, and then we come along after they've made the investment and change the rules of the game, whether it be tax policy, labor issues, environmental policy. We've changed their financial model that they had to rely on interest on to make the capital investment in the first place. And my colleagues, I've noticed a lot of them don't understand that is a freezing, provides a kind of a freezing of any willingness to make additional capital investment because there's something called risk now. Uncertainty, risk, I think, the common vernacular of risk is like, well, you crash and hurt yourself. Risk is also uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
And frankly, risk is valued in terms of spreadsheet analysis, capital investment decision making, company valuations. Variance and increased levels of variance equals more risk and thus less value in the cash flow stream. And I just think in terms of big picture, when at the state government, of course, much less than the federal government. But if we're interrupting the willingness of companies to make significant investments, which translates into jobs, we have a problem because that means we don't really kind of know what we're doing, if that makes sense. And then, I think the last thing too is just on a simple microeconomic level, Alex, I like the fact that you have a Star Trek Next Generation ship on the bookshelf. Lord of the Rings there. Hopefully the basketball is autographed by a Duke player. We'll find out later. That, for all you know, it looks like you're well appointed, but for all we know, those are on loan from a pawn shop. Okay. You may have a business, as a businessman or entrepreneur, you may be making $200,000 a year in income. Well, some people say that you're high on the hog, you're rich. But for all anyone knows, you've leveraged all your credit cards, you've maxed out your HELOC to finance your business, and your personal balance sheet might say you're in tons of debt that you're trying to crawl out of. But I will say a lot of my colleagues have never actually been in business. They've never been in the private sector, much less taken a risk that they're hoping to have pay off at some point. And that's kind of what informs my general view of kind of disappointment, to come into the legislature, find, folks not having kind of a full perspective of how the economy works, and then, meddling with statutes that affects the economy. And then frankly, not really engaging in the legislature as being a deliberative body to kind of discover those things. Kind of bummed me out, frankly, because that meant it didn't matter what you said. You could provide all the facts, reasoning, you can get out an economics textbook. It really doesn't matter because so many folks are wedded to their narrative for political gain, irrespective of what's really there for the common good. And I don't think there's anything more aligned with the common good than a good economy, for example.
So first off, just to show I'm not a fraud, that right there, my dad made me a Trekkie. So I 100% love my Star Trek. Read Lord of the Rings back in 6th grade. Loved it ever since.
Me too, yeah.
Basketball is not signed by anybody. It's just a basketball just because I like basketball. And
okay.
If it was signed, unfortunately, it wouldn't be by a Duke player because I am but to talk about some of your points. So I feel like a devil's advocate with that would be that where you're talking about from a business standpoint is not where the government needs to be mentally. The government and the legislature needs to be looking to help the people from the ground up. If you're looking to help the corporations, you're just looking to help the rich get richer. And that isn't a way that legislature or government should do things. They should be looking to help those on the ground. They should be looking to help those in the lower class and give them a leg up, and single mothers, minority communities, all of these people that rely on government would feel like you've turned your back on them if you continue to give tax breaks and different sort of incentives to big business to continue to grow and to continue to kind of hire your middle class suburban people as opposed to your lower class people. Um, Another thing that we take into account is where you're trying to help out a lot of corporations and you're looking at this in a corporation standpoint, you're not taking into account the effects that these corporations are having on climate change. And with these corporations doing what they do, seemingly, if we're taking the Trump model, deregulated, he still has a lot of effect on what's going on with businesses today. Biden hasn't completely eliminated all of them. We're now allowing these corporations to do what they want. And as they're hurting the planet more, again, they're affecting the lower income people much more than the people that have and have the ability to weather climate change for longer and stay afloat. So um, I just think that when you're looking at government from a business perspective, it wouldn't be the right perspective because now you're taking out the little man and you're not thinking of how to help the struggling community and the struggling minority.
Well, I think I appreciate what you say, and I don't disagree. The thing is, I didn't suggest we needed tax breaks. I suggested we needed policy stability, and any company in making a capital investment appreciates stability more than the absolute level of costs in their financial model. And so, I think my sense, like take energy companies of whatever flavor. It's not the absolute level of taxation or regulation that's a concern. It's the variability and unpredictability of what future tax policy and regulatory policy will look like. I think most of them would say, hey, we'll accept 10, 20% more, whatever that would be, in exchange for 10 years of stability. And two, I think I didn't really mention corporations. I think I mentioned entrepreneurs and risk takers. Most businesses, at least in Colorado, are small businesses. I want to think possibly in Colorado alone, there's maybe 600,000 to 800,000 small businesses. Most of them single, one to four employees. Those are not corporations who are aggregating wealth through being a publicly traded company. And granted, I think there's a lot to be skeptical of when it comes to large corporations that are publicly traded, because we see over and over again that whether it be Amazon, Uber, whatever else, the capital markets will subsidize losses in these companies for years and years and years that Main Street can never benefit from. I mean, how many years did Amazon lose money? I guarantee you, Jim's hardware store or Joe's bookstore on Main Street was not allowed to run losses for 20 years to get their model right. And it's just a peculiarity of how capital markets in terms of speculation will prop up these companies and distort wealth away from entrepreneurs and small businesses. So I think my remarks were really coming from the perspective of your smaller entities, mostly privately held, who are more affected by regulatory changes in some ways than even bigger companies, because larger companies can make a competitive advantage dealing with complex regulation that a small company can't manage. They don't have the scale to navigate that. And so I think if you think about the way large companies are, and there's a continuing level of aggregation in the economy in the corporate sector. It's a function of, again, the capital markets. It has a problem, and it goes to what you're saying about middle class and rising fortunes for everybody. In my perspective, is the best way to increase everyone's fortune is to have distributed ownership of capital in companies spread amongst everyone, and that is to make it easy for people to get in business for themselves and make for themselves. And that's just a challenge, and that's not something that government can solve, but government can certainly be mindful. And that's the kind of the underscoring, I think, sentiment I had about my feelings in the legislature, being mindful of how all those parts work together and what we're doing with a blunt instrument and who the winners and losers are with what we're doing. And frankly, sometimes we have to do what we got to do, right? Because there's a problem, there's a challenge, whatnot. but the mindful is not there. I would love to have, and then we can talk later about what I'm doing now. But yeah, very sensitive to the fact that as large companies become more powerful, the stock market becomes more of a fixture of what the economy looks like versus distributed wealth through Main Street and small businesses. It is leaving more and more wealth in the hands of a concentrated few. And my solution is not, my view is we need to kind of figure out how to get people back into business for themselves and having the ability to create value, not necessarily become employees of Google or employees of Amazon or employees of the government.
So I'm going to shift a little to
maybe I'm nostalgic.
shift a little to possibly a more touchy subject, but I think it has to go with the realm of the legislature and spending and things like that. Where do you see the government's responsibility in kind of righting past wrongs, specifically with the Black community and creating more equity among them and, kind of helping out failing schools and minority communities? A lot of the issues could possibly be solved by money, by reparations, by giving more money to these schools in order to help them succeed. Where do you see the government's role, specifically the state government? Because I think the federal government has a bigger challenge because they're dealing with it in all 50 states, but possibly just talking about Colorado itself. Where would you see somewhere like the Colorado government being, or what is their role in that?
That's a great question. I think it's difficult to find a role because I think Davy Crockett said, I'm paraphrasing, but we should, he kind of cautioned against creating an unfairness for part of the living because of a sentiment to the dead or another part of the living. And it is unfairness is, I guess you could say unfairness is part of the human condition. And any kind of policy initiative, like I said, you have winners and losers, and you try to accomplish the aggregate good or the mean positive benefit. In any kind of strategy you're talking about, ultimately, you're going to be penalizing those that had really no role in a role in creating the environment we have. They do have a role possibly in they do have a role individually in creating economic conditions that are uplifting for everybody or include everybody. Reparations, if you think about it, is like it's kind of I don't know how you even target that except to say blanket people by groups and kind of engage in a kind of a Marxist critique of groups at opposition to each other, and you take from one group to give to the other group. In a traditional Marxist sense, that would be from ownership capital or monarchy or whatever else, and distribute wealth to peasants or however it was viewed back in the 1920s. But certainly, I think that's kind of what's going on now between identity groups. But two things, you are unfair to one group under the idea of being fair to another group, but you are now engaging in validating a process of unfairness that needs to go on for the indefinite future. So you're basically saying that unfairness is okay, and there's no moral principle by which individuals should be guided. It's just really the government to intervene on behalf of groups and reduce everyone in each group just to the group identity, and not really looking at the heterogeneity of individuality in each group. I just think it's just an impossible proposition. So what I guess can make a connection, I'm working right now helping out a nonprofit. It's engaged in helping people coming out of incarceration get in the workforce and re-enter the community. And at least here in Nashville, where I'm currently located, it's primarily the minority community that's been affected by incarceration, and primarily a minority community that's looking for a new beginning and finding a way to engage the workforce, having suffered severe handicap and being able to do that. But that's an example of how we as a society can help individuals who through their own agency want to succeed. And I think in terms of government policy, if you want to look at what what can happen. I think no one would argue that it's unfair to try to remove barriers from individuals who, through self-selection, want to succeed. And I think that might be a way to proceed. And I think, looking at it that way, I think it gets to the mindfulness you're talking about, that some groups are marginalized, and to some degree, whether or not they're marginalized in absolute terms or not, they feel marginalized, right? And while it's a cognitive distortion, emotional reasoning, if you feel it's a certain way, that's how you feel about it, irrespective of the objective circumstances. And so I think we as a community can help individuals succeed that want to, and that does require work, and it does require government action. Frankly, it probably requires the government to take a hard look at repeal of many policies that put people behind. Incarceration's a problem. The unfairness or the inequitable way in which the justice system operates. I don't think anyone would argue against a fair and balanced justice system, but it's something that we can all get involved in to fix something that's by statistical analysis is shown to be not fair. It's not intended to be not fair. It's just how it is, but through possibly benign neglect. So I recognize the problem, but I think it's something that's got to be handled recognizing the individual spirit, and having compassion on the part of others to recognize that people need help.
So just lastly, before we move on from this topic, you kind of touched on a little bit of a theory that I believe a lot of your colleagues on the other side of the aisle would have embraced, in terms of that there is a systemic problem, problem with our government and the way it's structured, where our structure of individualism, our structure of meritocracy is inherently racist, and that the foundations that our founding fathers put in 1776 created a racist environment. They knowingly created a racist environment by excluding the black slaves, and a lot of them were slave owners to begin with. So what would your answer be in terms of how do we fix our government? Is it something where we recognize that there is a problem with whiteness, and that whiteness needs to be something that needs to be addressed as a nation, that we need to look inside ourselves and kind of understand what whiteness is in terms of something like the 1619 Project, or in a critical race theory view, which is in a lot of people's way, a good way to fix what is going on right now. How do you think our government should respond? Do you think there needs to be a restructuring in the way our federal and our state governments even exist?
Well, I wish I'd taken a refresher in the defense against the postmodernist dark arts class. But I'm not fully up to speed on that. First of all, there's culture that operates separate of the government and policy, and whatever is going on with cultures and subcultures, those are just the behaviors and beliefs of individuals who are engaging that culture. And quite often cultures are confused with moral principles because of the cultural differences, because of feelings of relative deprivation. But I always like to remind that folks that the government is ultimately culture blind to some degree. And so, we have a culture, we have, cultural challenges, and that, it's sort of for another day and another guest. But to your point about the government, I think that's the attack on the founding principles of the country, which is based on freedom as a primary virtue, the individual as a primary organizing unit versus the group, justice and the rule of law, and a blind rule of law as a primary value. Those are under attack because to some degree those are anathema to what the I would say, your leftist wants, where materialistic equality is the primary virtue. Transcendentic beliefs are really not part of anything they're contemplating, and they want the group identity to be the organizing element by which power relations are assessed. But I just want to say that, at the end of the day, because principles are not adhered to completely, doesn't mean that the principles themselves are flawed. That just means the human beings associated with advocating them, supporting them, or following them weren't doing a good job. And really, if you want to basically deconstruct the value of originating principles, really the debate should be on what the rival principle should be. And we're not really hearing that, other than, again, the postmodernist critique of materialistic, power dynamics. So I think at the end of the day, I believe in equal protection of the law. I believe that justice should be blind to the individual and applied equally to everybody. I believe in freedom of speech. I believe that the notion of freedom is the individual vis-a-vis the state, not, I first learned this in grad school, not what at the time was called a positivist view of liberty, which is fascinating vernacular, but the political left always has their euphemisms. The idea that, if I don't have, I'm not really free to buy a new car if I don't have the money to buy a car. It's not really through the lens of whether the government's allowing me to buy a car or not. And but really, it's the freedom, as I mentioned, is needs to be cast in the individual vis-a-vis the state, and that's how you safeguard the body politic. Otherwise, we'll all be drones.
All right. So,
but I appreciate the question, because I think the 1619 Project, narrative propagated by the New York Times, and then the appropriate critique of that showed there is kind of, I think, a attack on some foundational beliefs and values that so many people take for granted. And I don't know if the average American understands that, but it's for my colleagues who are politicians or former or recovered politicians like myself, but for them especially, but all citizens need to look hard and say, if we have these principles, are we upholding them? And I think what we're seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement this past summer, and anecdotal stories about how African Americans are treated vastly different under the same system that's supposed to be colorblind. I totally understand the critique and the lack of faith in the original principle, because after all, it's not necessarily working for everybody. But that doesn't mean the principle is bad. It really means we need to be candid and honest with ourselves that we're not treating everyone fairly like we're supposed to already.
All right. So that wraps up that topic with a nice little bow. That was a solid topic. I really want to jump right into the next one, because the next one is prevalent towards what we are still going through. You mentioned in one of your parts of your answers the human condition, and we just had something that has affected the human condition, I think, more than any other time in history. COVID-19 coronavirus, and not necessarily just the pandemic itself, but in terms of the responses, the various responses from state to state, federal government, different countries around the world, has affected our human condition in ways that 3 years ago, I don't think anyone thought would be possible.
Right.
So I'm going to give you the floor first. How did we handle the pandemic, I guess, as a federal government? And then how would you grade the way we handled it, or you guys handled it, when you were in the legislature in Colorado and having to figure out what to do?
Great question. It's always easy to be an armchair quarterback, isn't it? I think from the federal government level, if you recall, back in February of last year, whether it be through international organizations had downplayed the seriousness of the virus, and so I think, unfortunately, our the folks at the CDC or other folks in our federal government didn't really see it coming, frankly. And, it's really unfortunate. In some ways, that's kind of the original human tragedy, is that what, started out in December in China, didn't really seem by anyone to be that serious. And the World Health Organization kind of itself said it wasn't serious. And then by the time I think we started taking action, now retrospectively, the virus was already spreading. So I kind of I have to, like, to some degree, be easy on the CDC and the federal government in terms of not stopping it originally, because we didn't have the virus here, and we were relying on international experts who had contact with folks working on the ground who had been exposed to the virus. I think the Trump administration's idea of recognizing there's a heterogeneity of communities and climates and economies in the different states, and letting the states handle having their own COVID specific response made sense to me at the time. And I think to some degree, depending on the different states, there's to some degree has been a validation that was a valid idea. And it's really the Trump administration's prioritization of getting vaccines going and having investment in that, has proven to be a good choice. I think from the Trump administration's primary failing, frankly, is President Trump's inability just to kind of empathize with the plight. And frankly, he probably should have set expectations low to begin with, rather than, I think, to some degree, try to stay ahead of things politically. If that makes any sense?
Yeah.
I don't know exactly. Not really sure what I would have done in that position. Of course, he's dealing with a somewhat hostile media that he's kind of certainly brought upon himself, being a somewhat confrontational individual. So it's hard for me to look back at the federal government and see what could have been done differently, because even today there's so much uncertainty about the virus. It's striking a year later that there's still thoughts about, is it a respiratory virus, is a blood vessel virus, what's going on? And we really don't have a very good ways of treating the disease. But I will talk about states though. I think Colorado, Governor Polis, the Democrat, did a very good job of trying to thread the needle. And the threading the needle is recognizing two things. One, there is a public health and safety thing to be mindful of. Two, there's an economy and jobs, and the need for human relations to happen. That's also a priority. And he worked very hard, I think, to try to not go into shutdown panic and not to go into denial. And if you look on Twitter and all your social media platforms, you really are just really get confronted with both extremes.
Yeah.
It's fear, 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 shut down, quarantine. How dare you go outside? How dare you not wear a mask everywhere you go? And the other side is, masks are a symbol of submission. Masks are a symbol that you're being misled or fooled, or you're a pawn. The disease isn't serious. The virus is a hoax. That's all you see. But I think the governor recognized that it's serious, but you can only do so much. I think he tried to manage the regulations with the relative severity of the spread of the disease, and would relax and throttle things the best he could. And frankly, Colorado is a cold climate, so unlike Texas and Florida, where a lot of the human interaction in restaurants and bars, all that can happen outside, where infection rates are dramatically lower than inside, Governor Polis did, I think, a good job. He never tried to fearmonger, and nor did he try to underplay the severity of the epidemic. And I mentioned Florida and Texas too, because they're different states, and they're pilloried by the fearmongers as, not caring about humans and whatnot. But, the reality is that, they're different climates. different environments, and their citizens may want different things through their elected officials. So I think, generally speaking, we can look at several states and see success stories. And I think it's governors that try to keep a even head and be mindful of both extremes, and be mindful of not just the first order effects, which is the fatalities, but the second order effects, which are mental health issues, suicides, permanent job loss, people's livelihoods being destroyed, those types of things. And the second order effects, I think, are something we're still not really understanding yet. The stock market would tend to, going back to our previous discussion, the stock market kind of indicates that everything's hunky-dory, but it's really not.
Yeah.
Throughout the economy. And so we don't really understand yet what the second order effects of the pandemic are in terms of human loss. And my mother's 87. I'm not, while, many senior citizens passed away from the epidemic, I'm also mindful of the hopelessness that, people in their 20s and teens felt by not being able to have human connections. I had a close friend of mine commit suicide in June, my age, based on the world changing as he saw it, and encountering a lifestyle of isolation that he was not prepared for.
So part of me finds it bizarre that we weren't as prepared as we were, because I remember in my workplace in November of 2019, seeing videos of on YouTube of people in China collapsing and the police rushing to just grab them and remove them. And they're in the middle of the street. And I guess you don't know what to believe when it's coming out of China in a way. And I think that's something that all parties agree upon, that when it comes out of China, the first good move is to question it and then research it. So I think that's one of the most bipartisan issues we have in government, period, is question China at all costs. So the past administration, in a devil's advocate standpoint here, they did not follow science as well as I believe they should have. Dr. Fauci is our leading epidemiologist. He is still currently our leading epidemiologist and has been a voice of a kind of reason, I guess, on how we should tackle this and how we should go about this. And it seemed like in the beginning, Donald Trump was willing to kind of play ball a little bit with Dr. Fauci and Dr. Birx. But then as it went on, he looked to kind of get away from Dr. Fauci a little more and become a little more critical. And Dr. Birx stopped speaking at any press conferences. And then he brought in Dr. Scott Atlas. And it just seems like at one point or another, maybe early on, the administration stopped believing in the science that was being spread out by a lot of scientists and lead epidemiologists. And how did that trickle down in terms of the state level? Was the lack of leadership and the lack of believing in the science something that affected you guys at the legislative level in the state in terms of not knowing where to go? Or was it something where you guys understood your constituency, so the lack of federal leadership wasn't something that really altered your jobs?
Yeah, I don't think it mattered. I mean, I think, turning to the federal government is kind of a scapegoat. We're capable people. The state government has a lot of authority over what goes on in its jurisdiction, right? The federal government is really a source of maybe expert knowledge, research, and like I said before, I still don't think we know. We don't know what we don't know about this virus, in my opinion, still. Yeah. So we have a ways to go. So I actually think the main going back to about the preparedness, I'm still struck today. The lack of PPE in our supply chains, in stocks, and the inability to get it early on was really striking to me. And I remember like when, and in just November and December when we had a resurgence, I remember thinking to myself, how come every family doesn't have a box of disposable masks and N95s, depending on the circumstance, already in their house, ready to go? It still seemed like we hadn't really figured out the supply chain yet by which people could, choose to protect themselves. You wear a disposable mask to basically protect you from infecting other people, possibly, an N95 is the opposite. It protects you when you're entering a contaminated environment, and you can, people can kind of see what that might look like depending on where they're going. But that, still to this day, it kind of surprises me. The infrastructure wasn't really ever there for us to um, deal with an epidemic like this, and the idea that um, people were reusing masks in hospitals or trying to figure out how to bake masks to reuse them. I mean, it's just kind of preposterous if you think about it. And that's kind of what I always look back, really kind of wondering what the heck. I mean, this had to be on someone's bullet point list of major risk factors for the country.
Probably, yeah. So, I have to thank you for, going through that at the state government level. It had to be something, scary and difficult, not only for you and your family, but for your constituency. And I could imagine that every representative in the country, federal, state level, councilmen and things like that were very fearful. And it was probably difficult to worry about doing your jobs with that going on and with COVID-19. So thank you for doing that. I don't think our public.
Well, you don't need to say that. I mean, but actually, it was no different for me than any other average person doing their job. I had the same level of anxiety as anyone else going to the store. You're not really, and then you're sensitized to every little symptom you might have. You're like, oh my gosh, I have a fever. Well, it's because you ate some leftover chicken. It's not because you have COVID, right?
Yeah.
But
So
the anxiety was real, but I wouldn't attribute it to anything to do with my role. Is more just like everyone else. You don't know what you don't know. And thankfully, I was able to spend a lot of time outside last year, and so hopefully, people were able to do that, and that's really helped because outside you're at almost no risk when you're outside.
Jack, you're a rare breed, a humble politician. But we're gonna jump.
Maybe that's why I didn't do that well.
We're gonna jump into our final topic of the show, and that is immigration and the border itself. And you being a member of the Colorado legislature, you guys were more middle of the country, but you definitely had a proximity to kind of people that were still trying to get away from some of those border states. Probably ended up a bunch in the southern Colorado area. So what is your view on immigration and the border? And I do have to say, this is coming on the heels of the news that the Biden administration is considering maybe continuing certain spots of the wall to patch it up. So that was reported today. I don't know if it's hearsay because what's reported today is proven wrong tomorrow and then comes true, but it really doesn't. So that's our current news cycle, but I just want to throw that in there as a mini caveat. So what is your view on that?
Well, first of all, I got just to react to what you said. My overall view is the damage the media has done to the faith of people by treating the same exact circumstance completely different in terms of how they report it, depending on the administration and whose team they're on. And it's really, I think most people like me just want to know what's going on. And, it's kind of a bummer to hear how the vernacular changes based on who's in charge. But that being said, Colorado has a large Hispanic population. And I would say certainly, I'm going to say probably easily top 10 of American states in terms of Hispanic proportion. And so the notion of immigration is always first and foremost in the legislature. I don't know really. I understand why people want to come to America. It runs the gamut from the welfare state availability to the economic opportunity availability, depending on what people are seeking. And at a very basic level, when it comes to kids, whether people are bringing their kids or just sending their kids, want them to have a better life. So I totally understand that. And I'm pro-immigration, so I'm okay with a lot of immigration. I mean, we need more people, more economy, right? And it's really it's a macroeconomic observation, and we bring more workers in, get them to work, we're all better off, including the people coming into the country. So why wouldn't we want to do that? The trick for me is, how do you do it fairly? again, I'm a closed border person except for one giant gate where everyone can come in an orderly basis where, if you've come in before and committed a felony, you can't come back in, but everyone comes in, can get a green card to work. That's how I feel about it. Doesn't mean they're a citizen and voting. It doesn't mean that they have the same rights of being a citizen, but they come in and can work and should not be stigmatized or, be kind of on some underclass where they're just kind of on a cash system, et cetera, that, whether you call it undocumented immigrants or legal immigrants, those challenges that they face. So I totally believe in immigration. And, but, the reason I want it to be orderly and not have it just exposed to whoever can just get it managed across the border is because think about folks from the Philippines. They want to come to America, but they have thousands of miles of ocean between us and them. So why should they have less of a claim on coming here than folks from Mexico, for example, or folks coming from Guatemala or Honduras coming through Mexico? I mean, I think it goes back to what we were talking about earlier about fairness. I appreciate there are folks who don't want immigration at all. They like closed borders, no one else come in, et cetera, et cetera. I think that's a foolish view. But I don't really respect the folks who say that immigration laws are stupid and shouldn't be followed, and anyone can just come across the border and we should just provide them all the benefits and wealth that we have in America. I just want an orderly system by which it's fair for anyone that wants to come to America, and they can come in on an equal footing with anyone else around the world, without regards to where you live. So that's where I come down. Now, that's not a very politically popular opinion, is it? You don't really galvanize the hordes associated with that opinion because you're not pro undocumented immigrant or pro illegal immigrant. Come one, come all from Mexico, and you have all the stuff that citizens have, and that's it's not motivating like that, and it's not with again that's organized around identity politics, and it's not galvanizing like shut the borders, illegal immigrants terrible, Democrat plot, whatever. That's galvanizing too, right? I just have a simple macroeconomic view of fairness and recognizing that we have a good thing going, and if people want to participate in the good thing, we should have an orderly, lawful way for them to do that. That's not restrictive in number.
So, there's a lot of good stuff in there. And to give you the devil's advocate coming back, you mentioned that the media has done a bad job in terms of labeling what goes on at the border, depending on who's there and who's not. And I think you'd find that a lot of people would say that the past administration and their racist labeling, essentially to start off a campaign of saying that we need a wall of Mexico so that the rapists and the murderers and the gang members can't come over, kind of started to really gear up a sentiment amongst people that feel the plight of these people that are coming over here and feel the plight of the asylum seekers, and that they believe that casting all of these immigrants, illegal immigrants and legal immigrants, has created a negative sentiment in almost half the nation for immigration. You mentioned that, the people that are just all open borders and everything, you're not a big fan of those, but we have always been a country of immigrants. We've been a country of.
Oh no, I am a fan of open borders. I just want the one orderly place where everyone can come in.
Okay. Well, I guess the counter argument to the orderly place is we stole this country. There was no orderly way of when we came in and when we took it over as the white people, and then we continued manifest destiny. So to deny someone else their manifest destiny by putting up a wall or putting up a gate is something that would be hypocritical to the American way. And lastly, the dreamers that are already here, they deserve a path to citizenship.
100%, I agree. They came here. They were it's another great example. I mean, that's they grew up here. They're Americans. 100% agree with you.
So what do you say about in terms of,
But going back to the media, by the way,
yeah, go ahead.
the rhetoric of one politician shouldn't cause a whole professional community to fold their tents and um, become advocates, right? Maybe that's human nature to kind of be reactionary. And, if that's the case, maybe we'll see things settle down again. So that's something to hope for. But, that's just my disappointment that um, that happened that way. But, we'll see. Time will tell.
So what would your response be in terms of, in a way that we took over this country and how, our founding occurred in Manifest Destiny and the annexation of Texas and the war with Mexico and a lot of things that we did in order to gain control of this country? And do you feel it's hypocritical now to throw up a wall and throw up a border and throw up a gate and force people have to come in a certain way instead of kind of the way that we did it?
Well, the Mexican government back in the day, or the Spanish, had walls and gates. So I would say walls and gates are pretty much the norm of human history, going back to the Syrians, Hittites, Babylonians, Greeks, Romans. Um, it's always been walls and gates. I think, in terms of the metaphor for migration, I just wanted to have a wall with a large open gate. I guess maybe a turnstile would be the right metaphor I would use. I just want a turnstile where everyone comes in that turnstile, and we have a count and know who's coming in. Otherwise, there's no hindrance.
All righty. So that's going to wrap up this episode of the Media. And Jack, thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure seeing you. I've enjoyed your show, and I'm going to continue to enjoy hearing you interview other guests.
I appreciate that. So again, he's Jack Tate. He's a former Colorado state senator and a businessman. And I want to give you an opportunity right now. You mentioned what you're doing in Nashville. Do you want to delve a little more into what you're doing in your business life right now, away from the public sector?
Oh, yeah. I'm actually kind of working kind of with two nonprofits. One in Nashville. Again, it's helping folks coming out of incarceration re-enter the community and re-enter the workforce.
Let people know the names and basically where they can find there. And if anybody wants to support it, go ahead, throw it out there.
Oh, well, there's actually quite a few organizations in Nashville that do that, and in Colorado too, that run legislation for us. So I'd rather just kind of make a general statement in support of all these groups, because there's several of them, and it's just hard work. There's stigma, there's normal obstacles, and skills deficits. It's just it's a tough challenge, and there's a lot of good nonprofit organizations in this space. And I'm also involved with another nonprofit in Colorado associated with children's literacy, and that is a program that gets free books to kids from ages 0 to 5. And I guess I could say what that is, because there's not really another entity doing it, but it's the Colorado state affiliate of the Dolly Parton Foundation.
Okay.
There's many, the Dolly Parton Imagination Library exists in many localities throughout the country, and in their state, I believe 10 state chapters. And so helping get that started up in Colorado, because again, going back to maybe a common theme we've talked about, economic opportunity and giving everyone a chance and equal footing. Robust research shows that giving children the gift of reading at a very early age, with their parent or guardian reading to them with books in the house, dramatically changes outcomes later in life, and gives people the opportunities they're looking for.
All right. And lastly, anywhere on social media or anything that you have that you want to put out there for people to find you that you frequently use, or you're not really a social media guy?
Well, my Instagram page is hiking pictures. So if you're interested in
hiking pictures are awesome. The landscapes are always beautiful, so there's nothing wrong with that.
That's Jack Tate TN Instagram, and my Twitter is Jack Tate CO, and that's it's just kind of random stuff, not political musings. I feel like there's enough people doing that on Twitter already.
All right. And again, I'm Alex Cuesta, host of The Median. You can find The Median on Twitter at The Median USA, and Instagram as well at The Median USA. We're part of the Opinions Podcast Network. So go look that up on Twitter at The Real OPN, and Instagram at Opinions Podcast Network. Again, Jack, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks, Alex. I really appreciate it. Great meeting in person.
Everyone, have a good one.